So the cost to run a truck is pretty variable by each individual carrier. And obviously there's a lot that goes into it, whether it's salaries, brick and mortar, the cost of the actual equipment themselves, fuel. There's a lot that goes into it. I believe the ATR, which is an industry research group, came out and said in 23 that the average cost per mile is 226 per mile, which I believe was a 20% increase over the previous year's findings. I would have to go back and take a deeper dive on that. When you look at the cost per mile, though, the thing that you always have to remember is that our cost is variable, but for the most part, it's pretty consistent, right? So we're paying a driver, whether they're running from Chicago to the East Coast or the East Coast back to Chicago, the same rate. The maintenance cost on our truck is the same. Fuel cost varies, obviously, based on where you're going, but generally across the country, it's relatively similar. The rate structure doesn't, though. So you run a load from Chicago to the East Coast, you're going to have a very different rate structure than when you come back the other direction. It makes it really hard to manage costs when you can't look at each individual mile that you run in terms of inbound revenue against the same cost structure outbound. For years, the industry gold standard was a sub 90, so 10% profit margin. I think as you've seen trucking companies come out of the pandemic, it's gotten harder and harder to maintain that, to the point I think most companies right now, with the way contract rates and spot rates are pretty happy to be breaking even. I think there's, especially when you look at a lot of the research that's coming out of the ATA and looking at data, some of their rate structures that they report on, it's not horribly uncommon to think that most carriers out there are just barely making a profit, if they're making one at all right now. So the biggest risk on extended pay terms is the fact that we're not a bank. We just simply aren't. Our costs don't wait on us. So in fact, trucking companies' costs, for the most part, are significantly less than 30 days. You look at driver wages, for the most part, driver wages are paid weekly or bi-weekly. Fuel is paid weekly. So our two largest expenditures are our staff and fuel, which are almost always trucking companies' two largest costs. Those are paid out at least every 7 to 14 days. Yet when you look at most customer pay, the best you can hope for is 30 days without giving up a percent through factoring. And then you start extending further than that. You take a look at, let's just say for the sake of argument, we run a load that takes us 2 days to complete. Let's just say we pay the driver, making up numbers, we pay the driver $500 and we incurred $300 in fuel costs. Those $700 are paid in 7 days. We have 23 days before we ever get paid from the customer for work we've already completed and paid for. You start extending those terms out to 60, 90, 120 days. All of a sudden, that just becomes extremely hard to make the financials work when you're sitting on money for that long.